Hello, everyone. I'm AJ from ProWritingAid, and thank you for joining another session of Writing for Effective Leadership, a series that we hold on the third Wednesday of every month. A little bit about myself. I've spent over 10 years designing and teaching undergraduate and MBA level writing and communication courses. And in these webinars, I discuss how exceptional writing can boost your business, your studies, and your career in a really practical way. In February, we'll have another one of these sessions on effective leadership, and that one will be about storytelling specifically and why and how great leaders inspire with stories. And then in March, we'll have another effective leadership session on persuasion and specifically how framing, empathy, and understanding can move clients, colleagues, and employees to action. My guest today is Tom Wild. He's the head of client solutions at ProWritingAid. Tom joined ProWritingAid in 2019 and has played a central role in developing the corporate and B2B side of the business and managing the customer success team. So thanks so much for being here, Tom.
You're welcome, AJ. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be on this side for once, not presenting the webinar.
That's right. Tom's usually hosting the webinars, right? So, okay, great. Well, I'm going to jump right in. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to begin to discuss leadership. And so today's discussion is about effective leadership and why leaders must be and see themselves as great communicators. I have two goals for today. And so when you leave this webinar, my hope is that you have a far richer understanding of the link between leadership and communication. But secondly, that you can operationalize and act on this new understanding, and that'll give you a framework for effective leadership communication. I think all of us, Tom and I have discussed this, that all of us, regardless of whether or not we identify as leaders, we're all always in leadership roles in a lot of sense. So as a parent, I actually think I'm sort of a leader and a communicator. I'm a teacher, and I really think that as a teacher, if you see yourself as a leader, as part of a team, it really changes how you think about learning and about education, rather than just dumping knowledge on someone. You're actually trying to corral them and get them engaged and bring them along with what you're trying to do. Tom, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think you've hit the nail on the head, AJ. In fact, I made some notes earlier about this, and I was thinking back in days, I was doing exactly the same, and how important it is, also how interesting it can be in terms of honing your leadership skills when you're working. In my case, it was working with young children, kids, and that's a tough audience, and that really taught me a lot about leadership skills. So no, I'm just excited to get stuck in, AJ. This looks great.
Great. So one of the things I first want to interrogate a little bit is just, I think we assume that leadership matters, and that we assume that that good leadership is something that we really care about and something that we should work towards. But I was kind of thinking, like, what do we know that, right? Like, what does it mean to have good leadership or to be a good leader? And I think there's lots of different ways that you can measure or answer this question. That we all know that good leaders create a company culture where people feel engaged and people feel connected to their work, and they perform, effectively. But I was also interested in just like the material reality of good leadership, and do we have any numbers? And so we do know from the numbers that leadership matters. So according to a 2015 study of 50,000 managers by leadership experts Jack Zanker and Joe Folkman, they found this, that bad managers actually lost the company money, that there was a causation, and that good leaders made profit. And I think this is the most interesting point, is that extraordinary leaders more than doubled the company's profits in comparison to the other 90%. And so this leads to the next question, which is clearly great leadership has financial implications. So companies are invested in developing leaders, right? In developing managers. So here's what we're seeing. Organizations are paying lots of money to develop leaders. And one leadership expert, Jeffrey Pfeffer, estimates that between $14 billion and $50 billion a year is spent on leadership development in the United States. A critical person or a cynical person might say, what is everybody getting for all of that money that they're spending? Because I feel like I don't know if I'm seeing effective leadership at the scale of this investment. What do you think?
AJ, I think it's a fascinating point. I mean, it's a huge sum of money, right? So my background, interestingly, before I joined ProWriting, it was in the training industry. So I work with leadership training organizations, and you have to wonder what the value of that training delivered was, right? And how much of that training was actually providing real value to those organizations. I'd be interested to see that, because I've seen some good leadership development programs, but I've also seen some pretty shocking leadership development programs. But there's no two ways about it. That is a phenomenal amount of money.
Yeah, I think your point also brings up too. Can leaders be developed? Or I think there's that old saying of great leaders are they're a born leader, and that's a phrase in our kind of language. I think it's probably a pretty complicated question. I think that there's some probably basic innate things that are conducive to being a great leader, but then I think it's a constant skill or ability that people are developing.
Yeah, I think you're right. We also have many leaders who thought they were good leaders. And some of them, there is belief, there's inspiration that we want to get to the high leadership position. For many of us, that we necessarily to get there. So yeah, I'd love to see some more research into this.
Yeah, sorry, actually, Tom, we lost you. I thought it was on my end. This is a Zoom live right now. We lost you a little bit.
Okay.
But I think you were talking about the idea of like, what are leaders trying to do with their team members?
Yeah. Leaders, they can lead good leaders. Interesting that people.
Yeah. You know what, Tom? You're breaking up a little bit.
Have I lost my link? Sorry, guys.
Sorry, everyone. This is just classic Zoom life these days.
Yes. Sorry, AJ. I'm gonna.
No worries.
Let's see if that works. If not, I'll turn my video off.
Yep. Nope. Now I can hear you. Yep.
Yeah. So just to go over that, AJ, it was really just expanding on the point that can you develop leadership skills? It's something that's innate. I've seen plenty of leaders who really you could understand they had this aspiration to be at the pinnacle of the career, was going to be a senior leadership position, but really they didn't have the skill to deliver.
All right, so I'm going to keep going. And so I'd argue that communication is one area that is overlooked in leadership development. And clearly, as someone who studies business communication and as a professor of business communication, I'm really invested in this. But I also think what it means is that I kind of see leadership from a different perspective and through the lens of communication and how people are using words and whether or not those words are working. So there are 4 key abilities of effective leadership communication. And the first is empathy, clarity, adaptability, and then creativity. There are likely more, but I think these are the 4 essential ones. And the ways I think we all, as leaders or people who are aspiring to be leaders, want to think about these is that these become a framework for thinking about any kinds of communication that we're developing. So if we're, introducing a new project or a new initiative to a team, or we're trying to increase employee morale, I think these are places you begin to think about, all right, well, how can I be empathetic, and am I going to be clear, and am I adapting my message, and am I being creative? So let's jump in here. I think empathy is a term that we throw out all the time, and I want to break it down a little bit. And this comes from a leadership expert, Daniel Goleman, and he breaks down empathy into 3 different areas. So there's that all leaders need. So the first is cognitive empathy, and that's just from a sort of mental place, just understanding someone else's perspective, just seeing the world at least briefly, or at least as much as possible, from that person's perspective. But then there's also emotional empathy. And I think that generally leaders often, I actually would argue a lot of leaders fail to do this, is that we're at work, we prioritize the mind over the heart. And and I'm not just saying this because I live in California and I'm some new age person. It's not that at all. There's a big push for leaders just to become a lot more emotionally empathetic. I think during COVID, this has become increasingly apparent that you just can't ask your team to do stuff. You have to be aware that they're going through a pandemic and there's a lot of uncertainty, and that people can't slice their life, their work life off from their daily personal life. And so at the core of emotional empathy is just this idea of like, I can get what that kind of pain can feel like to be dealing with something. And then the operationalized, the actionable kind of empathy that we're talking about is this idea of empathic concern. And I think this is even more challenging and even more difficult, but completely critical, is just that idea of like sensing that others need something from you. And the best example of this is, as you can see from this photo, is Jacinda Ardern, who, and I might be pronouncing her name a little bit off, but there was this tragic, terrible terrorist incident in New Zealand in a Muslim community, and Jacinda Ardern brought all 3 of these kinds of empathy to this event as a leader, and in doing so, really got the Muslim community in New Zealand really just appreciated this, and they felt connected to her for doing this. So it wasn't that she went and listened to them, but she wore a hijab to which is part of both cognitive, emotional, and empathic concern, I think, to say, I get your worldview, and I get what it's like, to be going through this. So let's keep going. So clarity is the second big thing in addition to empathy. And I think we throw around the term clarity a lot, but we never really break it down. So as a leader, I'm going to walk through a couple big ideas about clarity and what that actually would look like. So one is, this comes from Tim Pollard, communication expert at Readercentric, and that is, you want to land a few big ideas powerfully. I believe that our natural urge as communicators is to tell people everything. We don't want people to forget something, right? But the truth, and I want all of you to think about all of the presentations that you've seen in your life and just ask yourself, what do I remember from those? And we rarely, right? I think we rarely remember things from presentations. And I'd argue because people threw everything at us and they really didn't figure out what's the one big message that I want people to leave with. And a key thing, I think we often, leaders, fail to do this, and communicators and teachers as well, is we fail to really think, what are my goals for this communication that I'm doing? Like how would I define success? And we often think, we want people to enjoy what we're saying, or we want people to feel engaged, or we want people to get what we're saying. But the truth is that you really want people to be able to retell what you've said, not just remember, but retell. And that means that if you're a leader and you're trying to communicate a message to your organization or your company, you want that message to go viral. And you want to craft a big idea, a couple big ideas very powerfully, so that people who didn't make your meeting or people who didn't read your email to them will hear from others. And those other people will, say, hey, what was AJ's, I know we had a big all hands meeting today. I know AJ was, talking about a new initiative. What's up? What's going on? If I'm able to craft a few big ideas powerfully, my team member is far more likely to be able to say, oh, AJ has come up with this new metaphor for 2021. And that new metaphor is, is an eagle, right? Just as an example. And we want to be thinking about flight. We've been building this company for a while, and now it's time to take off. And I think if you begin to craft communications around the idea that I want people to be able to retell this, not just I want to tell people information, like people need this information, your presentation is far more likely to be effective and to be retold and remembered.
AJ, I don't know, is my connection okay again? Can you hear me okay?
Oh, now you're good. Yep.
Okay, sorry about that, everybody. But yeah, I'm sorry I've missed a bit, but I think this is a really interesting one. And I love the point about, the goal is the message to be retold. But I think there's a really important thing here around clarity, which from what I've seen, is how do you
I think we lost you, Tom. Again, unfortunately. Sorry. All right, so now you're coming back. Sorry, we lost you for a little bit.
Sorry, guys. This is.
Don't worry.
So yeah,
it's out of your hands. Like we don't handle our own Wi-Fi settings, right? Or yeah. So no worries.
I'm just reconnecting.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna keep going on to the third part, and I think one of the reasons why we often throw everything at people, where we go, I want to tell them this, and I've got 20 bullet points, is that we think reducing things or boiling things down is dumbing things down, and that we're not going to come across as smart. And I'd argue this is one of the top 5 reasons why people don't communicate effectively, is that they're more concerned with the idea that they need to sound smart, or they know more than their audience, as opposed to actually connecting and engaging with their reader and getting their reader to be able to act on these ideas. So a really great example of this is Google. When they were in their early stages and trying to get funding, they developed an incredibly elegant and a really simple message, one that obviously could be retold, and this was their ideas. Google is the mission of Google is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And we talk a lot about elevator pitches. We talk a lot about the world is a very attention deficit place right now, that no one has any attention. And the argument I'd make to everyone is that we always want to keep trying to find new and new ways to refine our ideas, to boil them down, but while maintaining the core essence of that. But I think anyone would agree too that in the early days of Google, they likely wanted to say, well, we do this and we do this, and we have advertising, and you can do this, and you can do an advanced search, and you can find this. But the idea is that they needed to operate at the highest level possible, in the most direct and succinct. And I don't think this is dumbing down, and I don't think anyone that would hear this message would feel that they were being talked down to. Okay. So the other point about clarity is this idea of being reader-centric and really understanding your audience. I'm not going to read this entire thing, but what I love about this is Warren Buffett writing in an SEC handbook in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and he wrote the preface to a book about plain English and just writing in a way that people can understand. And I'll sort of summarize this entire thing. He says, write with a specific person in mind. And I love this. And he says, when I write Berkshire Hathaway's annual report, I pretend that I'm talking to my sisters. And I'm going to presume that Warren Buffett's sisters are not in finance. And he says, just write to them. They don't know anything about accounting or finance. So how can you explain to them these complex, difficult topics in a way that they get? And his last line, which I really love, is, if you don't have any siblings to write to, like my sisters, you can just borrow mine. Just begin with Dear Doris and Bertie. And I really love this. It's a theme, this idea of writing to someone who doesn't understand what you're talking about at all is a really good way of beginning to craft messages. Pretty topical today. Joe Biden was just inaugurated as president, and I love this anecdote about Joe Biden. This is what he says to aides, to his assistants who are trying to explain something to him. And if they're talking at too high a level, they're using too much jargon, here's what he says to them. He says, pick up your phone, call your mother, read her what you just told me. If she understands, we can keep talking. And I think this is classic. It's kind of funny, the theme, right? The thread running through Joe Biden and Warren Buffett's advice is an aunt or a mother. And I really like that idea.
Yeah.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah, AJ, sorry, I'm just going to persevere with audio only, but that kind of goes back to my point about confidence, right? To have the confidence to communicate with clarity or to lead with clarity. And I think we see too many people who believe that by using complex vocabulary, verbosity, unnecessary language, that they're actually communicating in an aspirational way. It's not the case at all. You need to be confident in your ability to communicate in a really clear way. Less is definitely more, as someone said in chat, I think.
Yeah, I think that's it. Exactly. Less is more is constantly the mantra that I'm repeating to students and to MBA students. The other thing is that it's far more difficult to say less than it is to say more. There's a famous communication quote, if I had more time, it would have been shorter. And I believe that audiences unknowingly really resonate with well-crafted, simple, elegant messages. I'd argue, there's almost this subconscious feeling of, wow, you really took the time to synthesize a lot of information and boil it down for me. And I appreciate that. This is what I believe readers and audiences are thinking. They say, I appreciate that. And I actually think this is the secret sauce, the ingredients of great leadership and great communicators, is that audiences feel they appreciate the effective communication. And they also appreciate that they now have learned something. They've grown, they have more knowledge as a result of your ability to communicate that knowledge to them in a way that makes sense to them. So I do want to jump in. We had two questions in the Q&A. One is, will you be discussing the different types of leader or leadership style? I like this, and I think this is such an interesting topic. That's outside of this emphasis on communication, but I actually think this could be a really cool webinar. And so Daryl, thanks for that question. The other question was, will this webinar be available on demand later? And yes, you will receive a link to this webinar if you're not able to stay on live. So thanks very much for those good questions. So I'm going to keep going. So the next one is, and I don't think we often think about this. I don't think we think about this a lot when we think about communication and leadership, but I'd argue leaders must be creative. They don't have a choice. That people's attention spans are limited, and people are busy, and people are working, and people are stressed out, and so to think that you can just come up with a message or come up with a presentation and then people will get it. I think you really have to work hard to be creative. And there's a famous book that I'm referencing here by Chip Heath and Dan Heath called Make It Stick. And they really get at the science of why do we remember certain messages, or why do we remember certain presentations or speeches. And they've come up with this mnemonic device called success. And so it's simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories. And we're going to look at, I'm going to pull up a video of Steve Jobs a short clip of Steve Jobs presenting the iPhone, the very first iPhone, which was obviously a huge leap from previous technologies. And what I'm really struck by is not so much just what Steve Jobs does in this video, but also what he didn't do, and like what I think most leaders, 95% of leaders, would kind of communicate, this really groundbreaking new stuff. The risk is to communicate it in a really simple way, but to take more energy and to take more time to be creative and think about how do we build something unexpected into our presentation? How do we do it simply so people get it? And I think what you'll see is that this clip from Steve Jobs, we can see the success mnemonic running through this clip from Steve Jobs. So I am going to stop sharing the presentation for a second. And then I am going to go. So bear with me, everybody. I need to do a setting real quick. Okay. Tom, can you see this, Steve Jobs?
Yeah, that looks good to me, AJ. Yeah.
And then I'm gonna play the audio, and thanks everybody for your patience. Sometimes Zoom and YouTube stuff, but I really think it's worth it to see this. And if it doesn't work, we'll send it out to you. But here we go.
We're going to communicate this. We don't want to carry around a mouse, right? So what are we going to do? Oh, a stylus, right? We're going to use a stylus. No. No. Who wants a stylus? You have to get them and put them away, and you lose them. Yuck. Nobody wants a stylus. So let's not use a stylus. We're going to use the best pointing device in the world. We're going to use a pointing device that we're all born with. We're born with 10 of them. We're going to use our fingers. We're going to touch this with our fingers. And we have invented a new technology called multi-touch, which is phenomenal. It works like magic. You don't need a stylus. It's far more accurate than any touch display that's ever been shipped. It ignores unintended touches. It's super smart.
Okay, so I want to now go back to our success mnemonic just to talk about, that was a really brief look at the Steve Jobs example. But as you can see with Steve Jobs, who's a legendary communicator, is that this is a really simple presentation, that he's using words that we can all understand. And then he does build in a little of the unexpected. And so when he says, we're going to use a stylus, right? And then the audience is with him. Yeah, we're going to use a stylus. And then he says, no, we're not. And we don't like stylus. And then the audience, laughs, and because it was unexpected. And this is the way that you keep people engaged and you keep people interested. It was also concrete, right? We had a great visual of the touch screen. It was credible. Obviously, Steve Jobs has a lot of credibility and authority in this. There was also a little bit of an emotional thing, and it might have been subtle, but you can see Steve Jobs is not just reading from a script, and he's not just reading product specifications, but he's excited about it. And when he animates how he discusses the stylus and says, oh yuck, this isn't what we want. He's really creating, he wants people to have an emotional reaction to the idea of this innovation, that this new innovation is just better, right? And that it's natural and it's our fingers, and there's something almost tactile to what he was doing. And then a story, right? So the whole, it might not sound, Steve Jobs' clip there, it might not sound like a story, but it is, in fact, there's a kind of narrative flow to it, right? Well, what should we do? Should we do a stylus? No, we won't do a stylus. And then he introduces the product, and then he talks about the features and why it's so great. So it's a short example of what I believe to be creativity. I think sometimes we think, oh, creativity means, it has to be artsy, or it has to be funky, or out of the box. But in truth, I think it just needs to be engaging, and it doesn't, you don't need to be a ultra creative person, but it just needs to be different. And I think this success mnemonic, building in some of the unexpected, making it emotional, locating it in a narrative flow and a story, but still being simple. I think this is a really easy way to be creative in a sense.
Hey, AJ, I'm gonna use that mnemonic in some of the sales presentations I do. I think I love it. I think it's great. I think it's really interesting talking about Steve Jobs as well, because I think, you could argue that he wasn't the most empathetic of people, particularly when it came to management styles and stuff. But what he had was a fantastic kind of, I think you'd call it theory of mind, right? The ability to understand emotions of, particularly of Apple's users, right? He really understood that really, really well. And he had an amazing intuition about what customers wanted. And I think in that example, he played that out for the audience in the auditorium as well, didn't he? And you're right, it's down to that creativity, but it's not kind of thinking out the box. It's not groundbreaking, but I think that is what can make it so effective sometimes. Yeah, it's brilliant.
I agree. Your point too about Steve Jobs kind of understanding, his audience and the users. I completely agree. And if you look at Steve Jobs' presentations, there's a legendary commencement speech that he gives at Stanford. There's almost a quality to Steve Jobs' communication style. Well, it feels like an Apple product. That there's he's just so consistently user and reader centric and so consistently accessible. And I think I always, that in the book about him, they talk about radical simplicity, and I think that's the thing. And I don't think we get I think few of us gets as radical as we think, as radically simple as we think.
Yeah, and AJ, just to jump in with one last thing on creativity, because I think I mentioned early on about kind of working with kids, and that's when I really learned about creativity or leading kids, right? Because they're a harsh audience; they won't give you their attention. So I kind of run a Cub Scout group every week, and that's the hardest gig I do. But it teaches you really quickly how to be creative, just to give it that slightly different edge to it, and that can be simple. But it's critical if you want to inspire people and keep that audience kind of with you, whether that's an internal or an external audience. I think
I completely agree. As a teacher, these four things apply, and I think one of the challenges of how old is the Cub Scout group that you do?
So they're 7 to 11.
Okay, that's a tough age, right? And
yeah.
I think the challenge that you have and the challenge that I have working with, when I'm teaching 18, 19-year-olds is really the challenge of understanding what their world looks like and really getting what do they care about, and what would they find meaningful. And the challenge is that as a 40-year-old person, I have to work incredibly hard to step outside my own worldview.
Yeah.
I have to make a really concerted effort to do that. And so
that's right.
Yeah.
And now we're back to that audience-centered point, aren't we? That reader-centric point, right? Where it's flows through everything we do at ProWritingAid in terms of, certainly from a kind of client solutions perspective, it's how do you put yourselves in the shoes of your audience, your reader, or who you're presenting to, who you're leading in this case.
Exactly. The other thing that I wanted to talk about too was adaptability. And the greatest example of this in terms of business, of leaders and adaptability is Barack Obama, who became known for his linguistic flexibility. And there's a famous scene where Barack Obama is president. This is back in, I believe, 2010. He's at Ben's Chili Bowl, which is a famous African-American restaurant in Washington, D.C. And he's ordering a drink. And he hands the money to the woman working at the restaurant. And then she says, "Do you want your change?" And he says, "Nah, we straight." And there was an article in the New York Times about this, and it was called Obama's English. And it's just fascinating, right? Because so from what a linguistic would say is Barack Obama was signaling he was using African-American vernacular English. And so the president of the United States, this is part of his identity. He was adapting to speak with and connect with that woman that worked at Ben's Chili Bowl. And then what I presume, so he says, "Nah, we straight," which if you're from around the world, it just means like, it's just a really informal way of saying like, "No, I'm good. I don't need the change from the 20 that I'm giving you." And later that night, what I'm presuming is he spoke to the Senate or he spoke to the UN, and, he wasn't going to say things like, "Nah, we straight." And, he could move between these different audiences. And if any of you have ever had a discussion with a leader and you felt like they weren't maybe really kind of talking on your level, or they weren't really listening to you, I think this is a good example of the lack of adaptability. And, Tom, you talk about working with kids. I think one of the things that you have to do with kids is you really have to adapt, meaning you have physically, I think with children, you have to get at eye level with them.
Yeah.
Right? You really have to get at eye level. If you're, I don't know, I always notice people that don't really like connect with kids, which is fine, right? Like I always notice that they just talk as if they're talking to an adult, and they don't adapt and get down at the eye level of the child. And kids really resonate with that. And I think it's a good metaphor for leaders, is like, really figuring out what does eye level look like for my engineers, or for my product designers, or for marketing or sales, or for this new client that I'm trying to get. Yeah, right. And Kristen brought up code switching, right? Or there's code meshing. It's super. I know. It's really fascinating. And the other thing too that is complex about code switching is you really need to be authentic. And it can get really, really complex. So.
Hey, Jay, I'm just going to jump in there because I think one of the things about adaptability is that it is one of the best ways of showing that you care, right? And as a leader, that's critical. And I think back to the best leader I ever had, right? In one of my first jobs, it was just a guy, and the thing about him was that he could adapt his style. So we might be at the end of a tough week in a pub, out of 30 of us there, and he was on our level, and he could just inspire us there, but just be one of us. And yet, the following day or the next Monday or whatever, he was pitching to investors, and it was just that adaptability of style, I think, that stood out. And like I said, it shows you care. It maximizes your impact, I think.
Yeah, and I wonder, do you think that leader Tom was that came natural to him, or do you think he learned that?
So one of the interesting things about this guy is he was ex-military, and I think he had learned, but he had learned part of it, but definitely he was just you could tell this. He was you describe him as I guess a people person. So he was constantly looking for that way in with the people he was communicating with, I guess. Do you get what I mean by way in? That kind of way to connect with them. Which is just like you're saying, it's getting down on their level. It's their eye level. So yeah, I think by and large that came very naturally to him.
I think your idea, or the kind of idea of leaning in, and some people are kind of talking about it, like I might pronounce your name wrong, but Bolong brings up a great point of, if you can communicate with children clearly you are one of the adults who get it. It helps with the ability to communicate anything simply. And your comment makes me think of, there's a great Wired series where experts have to explain a concept to 3 different audiences, and that'll be an adult, I think a teenager, and then a 5-year-old. And it's just wonderful to see how the message evolves and adapts for the different groups. And so, I think thinking about, how do I explain this to a 5-year-old is kind of a great, tip. The other thing that I'd say, I often say this about teaching, which again, I believe is all about leadership and communication, is I think you're going to do better at teaching, or I think you'll be a better teacher if you just naturally are curious about people. That is like, because you don't get to choose who your students are, but you have to find ways to be genuinely invested and interested and empathetic to whatever they're going through. And I think the same thing holds for leaders. Like, you're making me think more and more that great leaders, it seems like they do need at least a baseline level of curiosity about people.
Right.
And I don't know if you can teach that or not.
But AJ, isn't that interesting? Because I think we've all seen, I've certainly worked with leaders who struggle, and they're successful. They've built a business. They've spotted an opportunity. They're really committed. They're really driven, but they're struggling possibly with scaling because they can't inspire a team, because they struggle with that ability to, they don't necessarily have that interest, that what was it you mentioned, that kind of, that inquisitive nature about people.
Yeah. And I actually think this gets to something that Zeke brings up in the chat. He says, being adaptable allows the speaker to demonstrate authenticity in his or her messaging, and the audience can feel, which I want to emphasize the word feel, the audience can feel when the speaker is being real, or genuine, or not. And I think Zeke makes me think of this as my own view of the working world or the professional world, is that we're going more and more towards people being allowed to be themselves at work. And I think that leaders, as Zeke says, like, you can feel it when someone is being real. You just can feel it. Like, you can't quantify it, you probably can't capture it in data, but you can just feel it. And I think that, to me, is, like when you watch Steve Jobs, like, you can just tell he's totally engaged. He loves what he's doing. And I also think all of us know when a leader, someone that we're working with, maybe it's a leader or manager, we know when they're genuinely interested in us, and we know when they're not. So.
Yeah, there's no hiding it, I don't think. I think you're right, AJ.
And Daryl brings up a great point. Daryl had his point about, you're talking about emotional intelligence, right? And perceiving the feelings and motives of others, which is that empathic concern part that we talked about. And, I actually don't know, maybe Daryl probably knows more than I do. I don't know about how people developed, or, what it looks like when people learn, social emotional intelligence, something that would be a really cool webinar. But Daryl also had an interesting question about, like, if you misjudge your audience, then you could lose credibility. So how do you know when to use this tactic? And I think what Daryl brings up is the subjective nature of communication. That if only we could quantify this, or create some sort of objective parameters around it, and say, if you do this with your audiences, this is a formula for successful communication. And maybe this is why I love communication so much, is that it's as much art as it is science. And my argument, Daryl, would be, I would find the more low stakes situations to practice adaptability. And I guess an example I'd give is my students, if I try to talk the lingo of my students, they know it's inauthentic. And so sometimes I do it kind of in a joking way, just to say, like, I know you guys have a kind of, a Zoomer or millennial lingo that you use. But yeah, sorry, Tom.
AJ, I was just going to agree. I think it's a really interesting question from Daryl, and I think I totally agree with you. Right? It's about practice. It's about putting yourself in that position and being prepared.
We lost your audio, Tom.
Oh, not again. There we go.
Now you're back.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just saying practice. Right, putting yourself in the positions and being willing to learn. I think that's really, really important. And the more you do it, the more you will feel that you can judge that audience correctly.
Yeah, and your point about learning is echoed by Cecilia in the chat, who said, she says, everything can be learned, unlearned first, and developed if we desire. And I think that's echoed by a lot of the work that Carol Dweck, the psychologist at Stanford, done about a growth mindset. And I love your idea too, Cecilia, about unlearning first. And I've been teaching for over 10 years now, and I really more and more feel so much of learning is getting people to see actually how they already think about something. Because you really just can't, you just don't add knowledge into people's brains, right? A lot of it is getting people to go, right now, for example, for a communications course, I'd say something like, right now, you might think like this, or maybe you think like this about X. And we need to talk about that. Like, we need to talk about why you're writing in a way that you're trying to sound smart. And like, that's fine. I get why you want to do that. We need to unravel that a little bit before you're going to agree with my idea that you want to write in a way that's accessible and conversational. And Susan brings up a great point about, learning requires humility. And I couldn't agree more that you just being able to adopt a beginner's mindset is it's really difficult, and it's everything. It's absolutely everything. I agree, Susan. I wanted to see if you wanted to jump in, Tom, or if you're.
I was just kind of thinking about the expression, the learning mindset, and I think again, it's something that great leaders have. We should all have, really. All too often people think that they're learning in the first stages of, when they're in formal education, but actually, even the best leaders continue to learn throughout their careers. Yeah.
I agree that it's just a constant, it's the same, what we say about communication is that you're always developing as a communicator. That there's no communicator out there who goes, yep, I got it. I pretty much got this wrapped up. I'm going to be great from now on. And I think Cecilia brings up a great point about application as part of learning. And you can't learn without testing, fine tuning, and the cycle continues. One of the things for me that I had to embrace as a teacher was that if I'm not getting things wrong each semester, I'm likely not doing this teaching thing the right way. That if I'm not having any, oh my gosh, that didn't go well, if I'm not trying things, and if I'm not getting it wrong, that it's very likely that I'm not developing as a teacher and as an educator. So that's been big for me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, AJ.
And Daryl, I think Daryl's point is a good one to leave on is, are we not all lifelong learners? And maybe this is a self-selected group that's on the webinar who would totally agree with you, Daryl. And I think the question for us, or for anyone who's trying to get others to become lifelong learners, is to begin with empathy and to go, hey, why aren't these people maybe up for learning new things? And how can we bring them to that place without just telling them, or so it's a great place to end. I really appreciate everyone for coming on today. Tom, thanks so much for being here. And we're going to continue with these series. I'm really interested in all of your feedback, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us, to come up with new ideas for webinars. But thank you all again for coming today, and we look forward to continuing these discussions and these webinars.
Yeah, great. Thanks all. Great to meet you.
All right, take care, everyone. See you, Zeke. Thanks for coming, Zeke. Great. See you all. Thanks, Cecilia. Bolonla, you can correct my pronunciation if you'd like. Thanks for coming. See you, Fyodor. Always good to see you on these. Yes, and I know 1097hm@gmail.com. You'll receive an email with the recording. Thanks. All right.